Equity and Diversity, and welcome to Muslim in Minnesota, Keeping the Faith, Dispelling Stereotypes, Achieving Success, the third of the 7 conversations that make up the Office for Equity and Diversity's Critical Conversations about Diversity and Justice series. The Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries. Jody Gray, back there from the libraries, thank you, Jody, is responsible for creating a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversations topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. This is our 3rd year of offering these conversations, and we're excited to continue offering live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived, again, on that Critical Conversations webpage. We've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series. If you signed in, we'll email you a link to an online evaluation, or you can access that link also on our webpage. And as with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion among our panelists and moderator, and then move out for question and answers within the audience. For today's conversation, I'm excited to introduce one of our own in the Office for Equity and Diversity, Dr. Shakir Abdullah, who will be serving as our moderator. I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Abdullah. He is the Assistant Vice President for Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota and provides vision and guidance to the Office for Equity and Diversity's student-driven units while offering a creative voice on pre-college access, recruitment, retention, academic success, and graduation initiatives. In addition to these duties, he's responsible for campus relations, community initiatives, external relations, and alumni development, which explains why, even though I'm housed next door to him, I don't see him very much. He's very, very busy. An emerging practitioner scholar, Dr. Abdullah has publications in the area of multicultural competence, among other topics. His research interests include African American men, the experiences of diversity services staff, and Muslim student identity development. Dr. Abdullah is engaged as an active national presenter, consultant, and trainer. He currently serves as Vice President for the Association for Black Cultural Centers. Dr. Abdullah holds a Doctor of Philosophy and Administration of Higher Education from Auburn University, Masters of Arts in Higher Education and Student Affairs from The Ohio State University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Management from Wittenberg University. Additional educational experiences include international study in Lumdazi, Malawi, and participation in programs at the University of Cairo and Lancaster University in England. Dr. Abdullah has also written extensively about Muslim student identity and his own experience growing up as Muslim. Please help me welcome Dr. Shakir Abdullah.
Thank you, Ann. And I greet you all in the words of peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this event, Muslim in Minnesota. When Ann brought the idea to me, I was excited about the opportunity to share and work with others who are Muslim here in Minnesota and really just talk about the experience. I think I've only been here since December, so I don't have quite a year in, so my experience being Muslim in Minnesota is not that vast, but hopefully our panelists can work with us and share a little bit about their experiences. With us today, we have Dr. Awa Abdi. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota and a research associate at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Professor Abdi's research areas are migration, family and gender relations, Islam, development, Africa, and the Middle East. She has published on these various topics in various journals: Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Development, Southern Africa, and Refugee. And she has contributed chapters and books. Her book, Elusive Jannah, The Somali Diaspora and a Borderless Muslim Identity, is forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press. So please welcome Dr. Awa Abdi. And we also have Mrs. Kishwar Bayumnas. She is married with 2 kids and 3 grandchildren. She holds a BS degree in chemistry and biology from the University of Karachi in Pakistan, as well as an early childhood associate's degree. She has taken graduate level courses on Islamic history and jurisprudence from the University of Karachi, Pakistan. She is a retired disabilities coordinator for the Anoka, Washington County Head Start, and now serves as a member of the Policy Council of Anoka County Community Action Program. Kishwar is the founder and president of the Muslim Women Speakers Bureau, During her early days in Minnesota, she felt that there was a huge misconception and lack of understanding about Islam, and she took up the challenge of speaking about true Islam in schools, colleges, and churches. This job became more pertinent in the aftermath of 9/11. She has been called to speak about Islam, specifically about Muslim women all over the Twin Cities, and she's also been the president of the Women's Society of the Islamic Center of Minnesota and has served as a member and chairperson of the Council of Trustees of the Islamic Center of Minnesota. Please welcome Mrs. Kishwar Bayunas. And our third panelist today is Mr. Asim Shabazz. He is the lead innovator of Axie Supply and Core Strategic Design in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His company provides technology solutions for small and medium-sized organizations across the country, and it provides innovative solutions to complex problems faced by many businesses and organizations. Mr. Shabazz currently serves on several boards and community organizations, including the Center of Personalized Prevention Research at the University of Minnesota. He is the community co-director there. He's engaged in planning and the planning and implementation committee for Hennepin County's bus rapid transit system, the Transportation Policy Planning Task Force, the steering committee for the African American Leadership Forum, and is the president of Masjid an-Nur. He also serves on the Blue Line Coalition co-chair and the co-chair of the Policy and Design Implementation Team for the African American Leadership Forum, as well as being a member of the Urban Small Business Alliance for the Twin Cities. Asim has a BA in Organizational Management and Communications and a minor in leadership. He is currently completing his master's in Human Resources Development here at the University of Minnesota, and he also holds a nonprofit management certificate from Hamline University Graduate School. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Asim Shabazz. So the format for today's presentation, today's panel session, will be a series of questions that I'll ask the panelists. They'll get a chance to share and respond to the questions that I have, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We really want to hear from you, so as we talk, please think about questions that you may have, and it may be that we answer some of them in the process, so try to come up with multiple questions. So all of the questions that I share are not always relevant to everyone. Everyone doesn't have to take the time to answer them, but I would like to start just by asking folks, how did you come to Islam? How did you become to be Muslim? And I'll share last, but anyone can jump in.
I was born in a practicing Muslim family, and my parents made sure that I follow the fundamentals of my religion. As I matured and I started to read more into Islam, what Islam was all about, into the Quran and the meaning of the Quran, it started making more sense. So everything that I was practicing was making more sense to me, and I think I became very convinced that this was the true path that I wanted to follow, and everything that I was reading was making sense to me. So I am a convinced Muslim now, a more educated and more convinced Muslim now. And I truly believe in the teachings of Islam, and that's how I came to Islam.
I guess I was born into Islam. Most of us do not choose the color that we're born to. You know, it's true when you reach a certain age, there are questions that you can ask. But I was born in Somalia, which is oftentimes we say 100% Muslims. And there might be, that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, since you can find, people of other faiths in all corners of the world. But the idea is that the majority of the population is predominantly a Muslim country. So I was born into Islam. I don't think I went through that, process of saying, I'm not a practicing Muslim, but to me it's kind of both my faith, but it's also what has shaped me in terms of my formative years as a person, as an individual. So, in terms of, I have two small children, and I cannot imagine not raising them Muslim. It's who I am. Even if what it means to be a Muslim for me might be very different than what it might mean to someone who has gone through that process. So that is part and parcel of being, oftentimes we say that before you say I'm Somali, you say I'm Muslim. So it's part and parcel of the kind of integral part of the identity of the Somali person to say I'm Muslim. So that is, I was born into that religion, I guess.
Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. I would say my journey was more of an internal movement. I grew up in Boston and then had the pleasure of moving to Detroit. And I would say that though Al-Islam was in my family, it wasn't practiced. My family transitioned from the Nation of Islam into Al-Islam. And my perspective was one I had to learn on my own. So I initially didn't believe that there was a God, because if there was, there wouldn't be Detroit. And so my transition was more of an internal movement of a shift in my paradigm for how I saw the world and the possibilities within it versus a deficit perspective that I had acquired while growing up.
And I guess for me, my story is slightly different from everyone's. I was actually born into a Muslim family. Before I was born, my parents, inspired by Malcolm X, transitioned to El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz into Sunni Islam. My parents adopted Islam before I was born. So all my life I've been Muslim, grew up Muslim in a predominantly Christian society. And when I was 17 years old, it was, time for me as I was maturing as a person. I had to decide for myself, what is it that I believe? Do I believe in Al-Islam, or am I just praying and practicing because this is what my parents taught and my community shared with me? And that is when I was 17 years old, more than 20 years ago, is when I actually decided that, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there's no God but Allah, and that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is his final messenger. So I've always been Muslim, but I didn't really become Muslim until I was about 17 years old and decided that, this is what I believe, and everything that I've learned, has prepared me to believe this. Because one of the things I think that Islam does is it acknowledges and makes you aware of the other faiths that are out there. And obviously, existing in a Christian society, you're aware of the other faiths that are out there and what that means. And I think, for me, I was able to develop, organically into, a Muslim and a practicing believer. So that is my evolution. The next question I actually have for the panel relates to that. How can one be culturally Muslim versus a practicing Muslim?
I think it's most applicable to me because I'm the one who's of course, I think it's a very difficult question. I guess I'm someone who believes that most faiths have more things in common than what differentiates them, differences. So I think many faiths, in terms of some of the basic tenets of what they put forward, I think are the same. Culturally and I guess, in terms of my essence, my father and his brothers were Quranic teachers in the central region of Somalia. So faith in that sense of higher being, and also, the Prophet Muhammad, and also some of the basic tenets of the religion in terms of what it teaches, in terms of generosity, in terms of respect for the others, for the neighbors, for other faiths, etc. Those basic tenets to me are what makes me Muslim. So I'm very flexible in terms of whether a person who never necessarily practices, who doesn't perform the rituals, to me is no less Muslim than a person who might be very zealous in terms of how he or she might apply the religion itself. And I know that this makes me a little different than many in my community, or many, and I'm talking about the larger Muslim community, but definitely many even in my own family. So culturally, to me, Islam is part and parcel of who I am. It's my identity. It's a core identity that whether I practice or not, it's not going to go away. But also in terms of how I behave, how I conduct myself, how I relate to others in society, whoever they might be, is very much shaped and informed by what I have learned through Islam, growing up. So in that sense, I consider myself to be very much culturally Muslim, than in terms of, performing the 5 prayers, for example, per day, which I don't do. I don't know if that makes sense, and I'll be happy to elaborate. But to me, it's very nuanced kind of meaning, where faith is very important in terms of what it has shaped me as a person, as an adult, and it informs how I relate to others in society. So it's very important part and parcel of my identity, but that is not reduced by not doing what some other Muslims might do, which is the rituals or certain rituals.
In my opinion, a practicing Muslim is the one who has studied the religion and understands the basics of the religion. I feel the belief in monotheism, the belief in one God, believe in Prophet Muhammad, praying 5 times a day, doing the Shahada, and giving out the zakat, which is, the annual charity that you give out from your savings every year, keeping the fast in the month of Ramadan, and then if you have the means to do so, doing the pilgrimage to the best of your ability, if you have the means to do that. That is something Muslims are supposed to do, but only if you have the means to do that. So I believe that would be a practicing Muslim. And, following teachings of the Quran and trying to make them fit in our daily life. That would be a practicing Muslim. For me, a cultural Muslim would be somebody who was either born into a family which was not very practicing, but was a Muslim family. So you would just start kind of, calling yourself Muslim, but not following everything that the religion teaches. Or you may be in a predominantly Muslim society, in a country which is predominantly Muslim, and so you just started doing everything because everyone else was doing it, but not really truly believing in it, because for me personally, not praying would be difficult because, as I said, I started reading the Quran, I started trying to understand it, and after that I became convinced that as a Muslim, I'm supposed to pray 5 times a day. So whatever happens, that'll be very important for me. But I feel that a cultural Muslim, because has not really truly studied the religion, maybe for them it would be, if they are in the company, everyone is standing up and doing the prayer, they would go ahead and do the congregational prayer. But if I'm watching if I was a cultural Muslim and I'm watching a TV show, I would probably feel, that can wait, that kind of thing. So I think that, personally to me, that's the difference between a practicing Muslim and somebody who's culturally Muslim, not really truly understanding the religion.
I guess after listening, I had some time to briefly reflect on it. I would say what was initially highlighted, though, was the 5 pillars, which was just briefly described. So the 5 pillars reside as the fundamental perspective, but they're not there's an internal and an external in that perspective. The first pillar is the Shahadatain, which is the acknowledgement that there is a creator, one God, that is greater than you, that is greater than your ego, greater than your wealth, greater than the material world as you know it. And to me, once you have that movement takes place, then the physical manifestations of that start to happen, which would be the salat, the zakat, the fasting, and the hajj. And so a cultural Muslim, from what I understand from Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, is the one who embodies that. That understanding is one part you can't measure. You can only measure it by someone's behavior. And so it is in the culture which the habits come to be known. I can say I'm Muslim and look Muslim. Let's say the paradox we have today between terrorism and al-Islam. Then I can look at the behavior, and then I can look to see then what's driving that behavior and whether or not that aligns. So I think a cultural Muslim may have all the zeal and the zest and the faith. That's separate from someone who may ascribe to al-Islam as a blanket, but may not have internalized the belief that they are accountable for what they do as a steward to humanity before God. I think there's a difference. And so a cultural Muslim to me is one who practices, who believes, who is conscious and aware of their relationship with humanity and with the Creator and the greaterness that makes us one. I don't know if it's that person who's making their 5 daily prayers or not, because There's some people who have departed from the way. There's a surah called Al-Ma'un, which our mosque has a neighborhood program, but it asks, have you seen the one who prays? That means, you see that physical part. But then they arise from the prayer as if they haven't prayed. They're not kind to the poor, the orphan, and they give to be seen. But that's something that is being spoken of. It's an internal. We don't know that that's why they're doing what they're doing. The Creator is calling out. This is what's motivating them to do what they do in their practice. And I think that that's the difference that the Creator is calling out to make known. Forgive me for being long-winded.
Next question to consider. What has your experience been like as a Muslim in Minnesota?
My experience as a Muslim in Minnesota has been mixed. I came to Minnesota about 25 years ago, and I moved here from the Middle East. So in January of 1990. So when I moved into this winter wonderland, from temperatures in the Middle East scorching up to 100 degrees, that was not the only change. My husband's work placed him in a small town in Minnesota in Cottage Grove. And besides the temperature change, another shocking thing was that we were the only Muslim family in that small town. But, my first visit to the kids' school, to the grocery stores, really had a great impact on me. I was just amazed to see how open-hearted and friendly everyone was. I think I saw Minnesota nice in full action. So, I settled very well with me and my kids and my family. We were doing great. I think in about a year we had settled so well that probably the only thing different between me and someone else in the community, in the small town community that I lived in, was that we dressed differently, we looked different, but in everything else I felt we were as American as baseball and apple pie. But, with the advent of the Gulf War, I felt that the serene setting started to change a little bit. My younger daughter was in 7th grade at that time, and she started coming home really confused. She didn't understand why people were putting in very hurtful comments on her locker. People were calling her Middle Eastern or asking her to go back home. And so she came back and she asked me, she said, "Mom, home where? This is my birthplace. I'm an American. Where do I go?" And even when we were living in the Middle East, the best and most exciting time for my children were every year when we were planning to come back home for the summer holidays. So they used to really look forward to coming home to America. And now they are being asked to go back home, and she's saying, "What home? Which home? This is my home." So that was a very disturbing thing. And I felt that, this was something that was just not just going to go away. And I feel the irresponsible behavior of the media was really impacting the Muslims at that time. I feel that, this irresponsible behavior of the media even started to affect my children. And I wanted to do something about it. And that is the time that I took a deeper look into my identity as a Muslim woman. And that is the time that I decided to wear the headscarf or the hijab. I started wearing hijab after the first Gulf War. I felt that, I wanted my identity as a Muslim woman to be established. And I wanted to be a role model to all the non-Muslims around me because I had made relationships. I was very comfortable with my coworkers, with my friends, with my neighbors. So I wanted them to understand, to desensitize them to the image that was now associated, after the Gulf War was associated with the Muslims. So I wanted them to understand that under this hijab, I was still the same person. And, I started to do a few more things. I wanted to bring more awareness about Islam to the general community. I formed the Muslim Women's Speakers Bureau. I became president of the Women's Society. I started a food shelf. But all this community service and outreach to the public could not have prepared me for what the Muslims had to feel and go through with the 9/11 happenings. You know, when 9/11 happened, I feel that some very zealous people who were misguided and interpreted religion the way they wanted to, and probably hijacked the religion Islam itself. And if the media, you know, which was going back and blaring out anti-Muslim comments, were to look at the identity of the hijackers, they would have realized that none of them were very practicing Muslims. You know, these people who went ahead and who decided to do this were not very practicing Muslims. And if you look back in history, this is not the first time that someone has gone ahead and taken over some religious doctrine and given it their own thoughts. We have seen that happen in the during the Second World War with the ethnic cleansing of the Jews. And then we've seen it happen in Bosnia, in Kashmir, and then very recently in Rwanda. You know, the bloodshed that followed in Rwanda, we feel that, you know, people just go ahead and take over these, the doctrine of a religion and give it their own interpretation. So that was a few unpleasant things, but at the same time, I feel that there is no other place in America which is as open and offers so much respect and tolerance to other people's belief as Minnesota does. Both me and my husband have been involved in a lot of interfaith work. We have been involved with the, you know, with the churches, with Minnesota Council of Churches. You know, we work together with doing the Muslim-Christian dialogue, the Jewish-Muslim dialogue, and through that, I have realized that Minnesota has a lot to offer. People here are very, very open, and they have a lot of respect, they have a lot of tolerance. So my experience has been a little mixed.
Sure. I guess I haven't been here for 25 years. I've been here for about 10 years. And in certain ways, unfortunately, my whole experience in Minnesota very much coincides with the post-9/11 context. So I came here in 2004 to do research with the Somali community. I came from England, where I was going to University of Sussex as a PhD student. But prior to that, I lived in Canada, where my whole family was. So I've never lived in the U.S. I've never experienced, you know, the Detroit that you're talking about, the U.S., you know, racialization schemes and the types of class, you know, inequality. So I lived in England, which is kind of welfare state where there is inequality, but it's different type of structure. In Canada, the same thing. So I was very much new to the U.S. and I came as a PhD researcher, you know, and I stayed here for a year, went back to the U.K. And finished my PhD in 2006 and came back here to join the University of Department of Sociology as a visiting scholar. So my experience being a Muslim in Minnesota is very much shaped by the post-9/11 context, where Islam is definitely the other. Islam is stigmatized, it's under scrutiny. Racial profiling is kind of the norm almost. So in certain ways, I honestly associate my being here with a struggle to try to demystify the portrait of Islam and Muslims that we see in the media. And I agree with you, the media is definitely a huge issue here. And as a scholar who has done a lot of research with the largest Muslim community in Minnesota, the Somali community, I'm kind of that almost first, second, or third contact person to comment about emerging issues, whether it's the young Somali men who went back to Somalia, or the allegation is that there are some Somalis and other Muslims, including African-American Muslims, who went to Syria, for example. I find it very unfortunate that the types of political discourses that we have and the policies, and I'm talking about how the FBI, the Homeland Security deals with these important issues that require intervention, that require investigation, but also that often seem to lead to practices and approaches that are counterproductive in terms of the kind of umbrella kind of criminalization of a large community. You know, so oftentimes, recently there was an allegation that there is a Somali woman who went to join ISIS, and I had international media houses, and I did an interview with a Japanese newspaper. We had, you know, German. We have international and national media descending on the community even before we know if there is any woman who left, how many people left. So oftentimes what's happening is that one person, two people might be leaving Minnesota, which has probably over 100,000 Muslims, which has over 50,000 Somalis. And then we have this, you know, kind of, you know, media, kind of frenzy media coverage, which often portrays a community in crisis, which often, you know, portrays a community that is all potential terrorists. Basically next day somebody is going to blow himself or herself up here. And what this does for a large, Minnesota, which as nice as it is very ignorant. The majority of the population is very ignorant about Islam, about Muslims, and the diversity, the complexity, the communities. What it does, is that these media, snapshots that are very much reductionist, kind of these, potential, the crisis of the community, Somali community, the Muslim community. What oftentimes it's doing is creating fear not only of the larger community, but fear within the Muslim community, which has no choice but to go in itself, close itself off, because it does not trust the law enforcement officials. And I've written, opinion pieces, talking about how the FBI, deals with this issue. Oftentimes they come and they say, let's do community consultations. And I think the imam, you're the director, or the imam, sorry. The director of the mosque will, probably agree with this, where they come and say, we want community conversations. And the first question that they use to open the dialogue is, what's radicalizing Somali youth or Muslim youth? So they already come having the answer to us. So where's the consultation? There is no consultation. Of course, we don't have a formula, or this is what a terrorist looks like, or this is what a vulnerable young man looks like. Nobody has that recipe. But it has been quite challenging trying to work with law enforcement officers to work with the Muslim community. And I think Muslims are the first ones who need the security. Every Muslim person in Minnesota wants a safe haven. They wanted to live in safe communities. The majority of the Somali community went through horrendous experiences to come here, to find opportunities for their families. So they do want safe communities, and it's important for them not to lose their children to Al-Shabaab or ISIS, groups that are committing horrendous crimes against their own communities. It's Muslims who are suffering the most in terms of these extremist ideologies. We all know that. But when you criminalize the whole community, when people live in fear of the law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect you, it does not bode well for all of us or for any one of us. So, I think I can say that it has been, it's a struggle, an ongoing struggle to be a Minnesotan Muslim and to try to counter these stereotypes, these, because we feel like they were fighting on multiple fronts. Of course, many Muslims already have, especially newer Muslims, newer communities, Somalis, Ethiopians, etc. They're already struggling with the basic integration issues that all migrants go through when they settle in a new country. And then in addition, there's the whole kind of challenge of racial profiling. And just to give you an example, I don't cover my hair, as you can see here, but it doesn't prevent the airports, to stop me and my husband and go through the diapers of our children, and oftentimes take us on the stand. We are both academics here at this university. So we went through that for a couple of years, and eventually Minnesota Public Radio did a program on it. And by the way, for the first time, when I returned from Pretoria, South Africa in 2013, for the first time in 7 years, I was told, welcome home, for the first time. But we had the power to some extent to be able to speak up and get NPR to cover our cases. 99% of Muslims in Minnesota or in the U.S. do not have that type of voice or clout to be able to do that. So the everyday experience of being a Muslim in Minnesota is harder for some, many members of our communities than it is for professionals, for example. But it's overall very difficult, I think. It's challenging, and I think it's an ongoing struggle that we all will go, we're going through, but also our children will experience. Yeah, you have one, sorry.
I think they made both great points. They have a unique perspective because they immigrated and migrated to the U.S. I would say, as an African American already first, as a male in the African American culture and darker skin second, then as a Muslim, I think the other two pre-qualify me to be able to be Muslim in Minnesota. But I would also add that our community is African American predominant, and our cultural perspective of being Muslim in Minnesota allows us to get past the first two barriers of being Muslim, Islamic. We still carry the other two, but they tend to drop off in the light of the current climate. So we have the advantage, I would say, depending on what the situation is, to be observers of how people get treated, how we're used to being treated, depending on where we are. And I think that cross-cultural lens allows us to adapt in a way that our immigrant brothers and sisters don't get the opportunity to. Having grown up with leaders like Malik El-Haj-Shabazz, Elijah Muhammad, Imam Wafdi Muhammad, even the leader at Masjid al-Nur, Imam Makram, it has given us the ability to understand what intolerance is like, to understand what ignorance can be like when it's directed or misdirected. And Al-Islam then informs our response to those circumstances, and our cultural yoke, I would say, binds us to be aware of the eloquence or the appeal of anger and ignorance, and of the eloquence and the appeal of common sense and decency, and how to respond to our fellow brothers and sisters. And what makes us different, to highlight that, because sometimes we want to focus on the similarities when it's really the stark contrast that really polarizes us in a brief instance. So my experience has been a great one. I've worked with Search Institute. We've worked with the downtown clergy, the Minnesota Council of Churches. We've worked with Rabbi Zimmerman, and I've been to Seders, and I've made salat in synagogues and in churches and in Egypt. And it's been a whole experience for me. But it has been one that says that humanity in and of itself has stark contrasts. That's just not necessarily attributed to Al-Islam and being Muslim here in Minnesota. It's such a rich cross-sector, I'm not going to use this, cross-sector of cultures here in this small microcosm of the world, that I get to see the rich tapestry that God has placed as humanity in front of me, the colors, the diversity, the languages. And it has given me a great appreciation for what it has taught me in my fluidity in being able to accept humanity. So, yes, I pray outside. I know that there are certain places I can greet other Muslims, and I'm like, hey, assalamu alaikum, and everyone. I'm like, okay, it should not have happened here. Hey, how's it going? So you learn to code switch, and you learn to adapt, and I appreciate that. But Minnesota Nice creates an air of courtesy initially for you to be able to express yourself. If you're in Detroit or Chicago, you get blown off. They're more abrasively upfront about their boundaries. But here, there's a lot more. We'll let you do that. And so you get to at least feel empowered until you realize that people are whispering behind you and you're not getting feedback that you need, which in some sense is empowering because you get to not feel the immediate criticism, but then you always walk with this quieting doubt. Am I really being accepted? Am I really a part of the community? Or are we just waiting for an event to serve as a reason for people to vent about my being in the community? So I think that being African American in America, in Minnesota, which we're still the minority, it gives us a cultural continuum to look at what it's like to be Muslim in Minnesota. That sounds like freedom.
So we're going to open it up shortly for questions from the audience, but one additional question before we get to their questions. That question is, does anybody else have their cell phone? No. That's my brother. I'm just messing with him.
Music makes that announcement. Please turn off your cell phone.
Yeah. So the question that I'm going to ask is, what are you most frequently asked about your Muslim faith? What questions are you most frequently asked? And you know, not to take too long, but I want you to share the questions you're asked most frequently and the responses to those questions.
I think I have most often been asked because, you know, whenever I'm speaking and I'm telling people that Islam is a religion of peace, the question I'm most often asked is, if Islam is a religion of peace, then why do we have so much violence connected to Islam? And, you know, the tactics of ISIS in recent days are an example. So because of that, I think people have a hard time. And then, you know, my response would be what I said earlier, that, you know, sometimes people, a group of people just take over the religious doctrine and give it its own interpretation, and then, you know, just come up with something different. So, which I feel that, you know, at this time probably ISIS is doing. But that's the question that I'm most often asked, that if Islam is the religion of peace, why do we see so much, you know, violence connected?
Actually, the one I am often asked relates to my not covering my hair. And because most people look at me and can tell I'm either Somali or Ethiopian. So kind of the regional. And once I speak Somali or I say I'm Somali, there is this, but all Somali women cover their hair or dress a certain way. Why don't you? I often get that. And I don't think many of them will read the articles I published. But, you know, not everybody covered their hair in Somalia when I was growing up. So I always say I did not cover my hair when I was in Somalia, and I still don't. So I did not change that much. But that is, oftentimes it's the dress that I get, because I look a little different than many of the women who are ethnic.
Mine would change depending on what's in the media at that time. Right now it is ISIS, but it's always the underlying current of violence in Islam, whether it's against women, whether it's against fellow Muslims or the Jewish community. In the end, the underlying question, I think, is why a religion which ascribes to the virtues of peace in its doctrine and self-restraint from anger is so angry. And my response to that is the Quran, for me, liberated me from the actions of humanity and ascribing that to God and what God actually calls you to. And so I usually answer that human beings, we are called away from anger because our passion can overrule our intellect and our faith, and it can put us in a very dark place. And that is in any faith, in any human being, in any tradition. It just so happens that when you say Al-Islam, you sell a lot more copies, you get a lot more advertisements, you get a lot more readership when it happens to say Muslim, Islam, or terrorist. And I think that that's my question that I'm often having to grapple with, the paradox or the contradiction between what is expressed through the media as a global epidemic and what I actually live with and share in the community of peace, and being able to reconcile the two.
So now I would love to open it up to the audience to get questions, and we have one right here. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. So if you could share that for this woman.
Thank you.
You know, your description and your experiences have been very good, and actually they have been very eye-opening. One thing which I am seeing that we have avoided the topic here is that the world didn't start from 9/11. World was there here before that also. 30, 40 years ago, have you ever heard about Muslims being terrorists or extremists 40 years ago? So what made, there must be some reason why suddenly there's a change of attitude by the Muslims, right? So that needs to be probed. It needs to be forward. I'm just quoting John Esposito when he gave a very good talk here in the University of Minnesota, and he said when the Gulf War was going on, our people were seeing a different war, and the people who were there were seeing a different war. And that is the reason why both of them will never reconcile. We were showing the people how accurate our bombers are. They put the crosshair on a building, and the building is demolished. But then they will stop. And the people in the Middle East and all over the world, they were seeing what was happening after the bombing happened. How many people were burned alive? How many people were killed? How many? So it was a completely different view. Both of them were having that. Now, we have to find out. Don't you think that we have to find out the reason why there is a violence attributed to the Muslims, which they are actually doing it in terms of ISIS and so many other organizations, like in Nigeria, they've kidnapped the girls over there and got them married, and so many things have done. Is it because of what some of the people are thinking about Bosnia? In Bosnia, there were 50,000 Muslim women were raped, and there were almost 100,000, 200,000 people were killed. Is it the repercussion? It is the thing that people are frustrated, they cannot do anything, and therefore they are doing it? Or is it some other reason? I think a political solution is needed, not a military solution to all of these things.
And I think the question you posed is a pretty, I guess I don't want to say convoluted, but it's so many angles that you've touched on. So many different things in terms of the geopolitical struggles, so many different things in terms of the cultural experiences that impact the manifestation or the practice of al-Islam, and I don't know that they are all interrelated, but what happens is the narrative that is shared in the United States is that everything that each Muslim does is related to each other, which is really so far from the truth, because culturally there are so many different divergences between the practice of al-Islam, and I think it's important for people to understand that. People have to understand that, Islam is practiced by 1.6 billion people around the world, and the way that it shows up in a province in China is very different than how it shows up in Croatia, shows up in Detroit, how it shows up in South America. It is all very different, but the challenge that I think Muslims, that we all see individual Muslims deal with, particularly in the United States, is that they then have to be responsive to cultural shifts and cultural conflicts that existed, long before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, long before Islam came along. Some of those same cultural practices are still embedded in culture, in the experiences of folks who are also Muslims. So I think it's important to understand, and we have to help people understand that Islam is not a monolithic culture. It is very far from a monolithic culture. And I think if we can help folks understand that, then people understand then that an issue in one region, in one country, in one city is that region, that city's issue, and it is not necessarily an Islamic issue. It's a regional cultural issue, and I think that's hard for people to understand.
I would just add, when it comes to that, Dr. Shakir made some very good points about the fact that the generality becomes the easiness to point the finger at a common enemy or threat. For me as African American, and likewise, it's easier to say black male, African American, and that automatically fills in the rest of the dots. The brain doesn't have to work with the complexity. I also think, though, because of the system that we have now, and I say the system of media, its interconnectedness, it's easier for me to probably hijack, do something wrong, and know if I want to be famous in 15 minutes or less, say I'm Muslim, create a litany, let's say a book or a charter for why I'm doing what I'm doing, whether or not it's connected to that or not, the world I know will eat that up. And I think that right now is the greatest challenge that we have in this interconnected world, is how do we discern someone's need to be recognized, the ego's need to be recognized for something, and them knowing what to grab onto to get that recognition. And I think that puts us in a different space, because if it's an African-American male who who goes in and robs the liquor store, it dehumanizes the human beings attached to it and allows us just to think in those broader terms. So the complexity will always, in this case, for how we think, the way the brain is designed, will go to the generality. We have to put thought into suppressing our fears, knowing the dynamics, and understanding what's being at play, but the greater population doesn't carry that burden.
I want to add a couple of more things. I think
I apologize, if you could use the microphone, it will help the people. Thank you so much.
No, I just want to add a couple of things. I think you are absolutely right in terms of the invisibility of the geopolitics, and I think you already. So when we look at Iraq, before the intervention, the U.S. intervention in 1991, of course you had Saddam Hussein, who was a dictator, who was brutal, who was, using poison gas on his own people, some people, Kurds, for example. But you did not have the type of chaos and anarchy that you have now. Women in Iraq were one of the group most educated in terms of as a group in the world. The most famous architect now in the world, the one who is designing everything in Japan, she is Iraqi woman who was educated under Saddam Hussein, or at least in the post-independent Iraq. Now women cannot get out of their houses because of the extreme level of violence, not only against women but against everybody. So and then Egypt, under Libya. I think and again maybe it's that complexity. It's very difficult to grasp the geopolitics and the realpolitik of American foreign policy. But it's also, I think, naive for us to say that the situation in many Muslim countries and also Pakistan, Afghanistan, is the way it is, just because, it's Muslims who are, crazy and who are violent. The U.S. and other, foreign policies have had great role to play in the condition and the political crisis that we are witnessing in these countries. So it's definitely complex, but the U.S. is far from innocent. It's not Muslims who have created this chaos. The U.S. has played a very important documented role over the course of the last 50 years or so.
I guess I would add to that, though, if you don't know your history, if you know your history, you would know that historically for the last 1,500 years, roughly, Al-Islam was the equivalent of America. It was the pillar of pride for so many cultural communities. And when you said it, you had a sense of belonging to something great. You had a sense of belonging to an economic engine that was known for heroes in science and for architectural design and culture and medicine. And then you look at how, over time, internally, there was some internal risks, if you know your history, that we deviated from what Allah calls for in the Quran and Muhammad sallallahu ascribed to the way to lead humanity. And I might anger some people saying that we got what we built. And it was dismantled over time, and it resulted into now a situation where you have to go study history less than 100 years ago, really, to see what happened. And I think that pain that exists in the psyche of once being part of something great and now being reduced to rubble, being puppets, I think that has a lot to do with the broken identity that we now struggle with, these notions of a caliphate, that are all attempts to try to get back at some way of saying we are still powerful people, we're not just puppets, we are somebody. The tools that they're using, I think, I know are misguided too, because every human being wants to be recognized for something great, and I think that we're just grabbing on the wrong tools to express the human dignity of greatness, which are further diminishing the role of Al-Islam in some places, not everywhere now, because it still grows, it's still enlightened, but the media gives more precedent to that. So it is a complex problem for all of us.
Other questions from the audience? There was a hand in the back.
I appreciate you attempting to use. I know it's challenging.
Go ahead, sir. Oh, you got to take them. Yeah. That one might not be working, but that's the one that wasn't working for me.
Sorry about that.
Yes, Keith Ellison is supposed to be the first Muslim congressman, but he's from the Nation of Islam, which is very racist and quite violent. So I'm wondering, are they really a legitimate Muslim organization, or are they kind of a fake Muslim organization? Because to me, they're not really very Muslim. I mean, what's your opinion about the Nation of Islam?
Well, first of all, Keith Ellison is not a member of the Nation of Islam.
Well, he was.
He emerged from the Nation of Islam, and I think we kind of talked about some of the transitions that many African Americans made from the Nation of Islam following El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, so Malcolm X. So when Malcolm X transitioned, there were a great deal of African American Muslims who transitioned from the Nation of Islam to Orthodox Islam, and I think you know those notions do exist that. If you're African American, you are a member of the Nation of Islam, whereas that's really not the case. The Nation of Islam is, not necessarily an offshoot of Islam. They use Islam in their title. Some of their practices more recently in the last 20 years are more closely aligned with Orthodox Islam. But the Nation of Islam, in its essence, is not necessarily an Islamic organization. So it's hard to say that because, as Muslims, our job is not to decide who's Muslim, but their practice demonstrates that they don't necessarily follow the Quran and the Sunnah. So Muslims, our faith is grounded on the Quran, the book, the Muslim holy book that tells us how we live our lives, and then the Sunnah, which are the habits and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Christianity, within the last 10 years, there was a What Would Jesus Do campaign, trying to figure out what would Jesus do in this case. Well, Muslims ask, what would the Prophet Muhammad do? And that's outlined for Muslims in hadith, narratives and volumes that his companions compiled, and that actually leads and guides Muslim life. The Nation of Islam doesn't necessarily follow Quran or Sunnah. So their theology did emerge kind of from a black separatist, black independence movement, and you also have to know the era in which the Nation of Islam was created. It was very, very hostile for African Americans in this country. And I think it's also important to understand that the Nation of Islam itself ended in 1977, when Imam Muhyiddin Muhammad sold all of his assets and broke it apart. It was recreated a few years later, Minister Louis Farrakhan, and it is as it exists today. But Keith Ellison was never a part of that organization.
And I don't know if that mic works.
No, this one doesn't.
It does?
It does not.
I think I would add, though, to the question, it's about context again and understanding what promotes human beings to either excel in human excellence and the things that we value and those virtues versus the situation for which when you today speak of the Nation of Islam as a racialized unit or group in America, and whether or not Keith Ellison is still a part to that, you have to go back to the cultural context that was a reaction to an oppressive, racial, Jim Crow, very segregated America, which in and of itself was racist. And that reaction was in that extreme to say we won't live underneath that we are dignified people. And there was a lot of mythos in there underneath Elijah Muhammad. And that was a reaction. And that's just what I just described today. When you look at the culture of Al-Islam, you have a lot of extreme reactions to a reaction for which people are suffering in. Fast forward today to Imam Muhyiddin Muhammad after the passing of Elijah Muhammad, and Imam Muhyiddin Muhammad has passed as well. May Allah be pleased with him. You had a movement from acknowledging this was a myth, this was ascribed to, it got us to a certain point. Now, people, here is Al-Islam, and this is its representation here in America, and we're going to learn and apply it, which resulted in the mass conversion, the largest in American history, from what you would call a group or a cult, depending on which historical text you read, to Al-Islam. And so that was the adoption. And Keith Ellison is along that continuum because most of us who want to be activists came in through that activist lens of the Nation of Islam for racial equality, which initially was believed underneath Marcus Garvey to be a result of separatism. harsh language, which Malcolm X, who became Malik el-Haj Shabazz, has been actually served as a gateway, I think, for most African-American Muslims to discover the peace and the serenity of al-Islam in the way of managing yourself and the continuity of humanity. So I would not separate the context of history from the present day when you say it in that way, because everyone has evolved on that continuum, for better or for worse.
There's a question here.
Thank you very much for the great talk. Mine specifically to Awa. I was just interested from your explanation of cultural and practicing Muslim. I just was interested in your sociological study of the Somali community, especially here in Minneapolis. If you've came across, if there's a definition for those two, cultural and practicing Muslim within the Somali community, and if they do, what that definition is. Do you see what I'm saying? Where I'm going with?
I wouldn't even know how to express that in Somali when I'm interviewing people. Because I honestly don't think we don't go at, there's this assumption kind of that unless you say otherwise, every Somali is a Muslim. We all approach that. But I've never done research in terms of, the questions of religiosity. So I don't have any research that looks at religiosity in terms of how people might identify, how, people might have, reflected on the religion itself and decided to stick with it and become practicing or not. But what I do know in terms of the number of people I've talked to in different parts of the world where I do research, the book I just finished is actually comparative migration research, and I did, it's a 3-case study, United Arab Emirates, South Africa, and the U.S. You meet people who belong, like all religions in the spectrum, people who don't practice at all. But, we always say you can never, ever ask that person or tell that person that they're not Muslim, because it's such an integral, emotional part of their identity. So, and then people who are very visibly practicing and make sure that that they cannot miss the prayer, if you go over the interview by 2 minutes. So, I think like all communities, all Muslims everywhere in the world, I think this probably holds true. You have the whole spectrum, in terms of, but for most people, especially people born into majority Muslim populations, that identity is an integral part of who they are, what defines them as human beings.
And I guess on a related note, in my research on college students, I've actually come up with a Muslim student identity development theory that actually talks about that continuum in terms of, cultural Muslims, practicing Muslims, Muslims who have stepped away from the religion, Muslims who have, zealously jumped into their religion, and then Muslims who have found a comfort level, a space where they can be as Muslim and every American English or whatever, whatever their other culture is as well. So I've theorized it, haven't operationalized it yet, but would love to get to a point where we can start asking some of those questions to say, this identifies a Muslim in this phase or in this stage. So. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the question of wearing a hijab or not, is it generally seen as a personal decision, or in the case of you who are not wearing it, do you ever get criticized within the Somali community for not wearing it?
And I will let the sisters speak on that, but in terms of Muslims, we are charged to dress modestly. And that is the extent of the command from the Quran. So how that's interpreted, very.
I teach actually, for anyone who's taking a course, I'm teaching a course, the title is Gender and Family in the Islamic World. I teach it in January. So I agree with the moderator that Islam is not monolithic. Here it's such a complex religion, it's such 1.6 billion people around the globe. So of course diversity is very much part and parcel of China, in Minneapolis. So I do get criticized, yes. I remember when I started doing my field work in 2004, I was at the corner of Cedar and Riverside doing an interview at a money transfer company. And there was a young girl, 4 years old, 5 years old, who said, but Mom, look, because I was speaking Somali, she could tell I was Somali. She said, there's a Somali woman whose hair is not covered. And to her, it did not make sense. So I do get criticized, but my counter-argument often is that when I was growing up in Somalia, none of my sisters covered their hair. I did not cover my hair. Actually, the majority of Somali, the cultural practice of Somali nomadism, a woman did not cover her hair until she got married. So it was a sign that you were available for courting, kind of, that you don't cover. So in Somalia, in Nigeria, in many parts of the world, covering your hair was not a practice that was widespread. Some women, and then what women were, again, very much differs from what we see here. So a lot of women wear, my mom still wears very, small headscarf that covers her hair, but does not cover her neck. But definitely people dress very modestly. So the head covering is in different societies at different times, because within the span of 80 years from the Civil War to now, in Somalia, it's impossible to find, and I've traveled back to Somalia many times, it's impossible to find a woman whose hair is not covered. If I visit Somalia, I cover my hair. I have to, because you will stand out. Whereas when I was younger, I would not stand out. I would be just part of the landscape, where you have a whole spectrum. So it's so things change in both space and time. And Islam is very monolithic in terms of the whole spectrum of what culture, local cultures and the religion Islam, how those are brought together in any given context differs across the globe.
I guess briefly I would add, though, from the Quran, the definition is to guard your modesty. And modesty is seen, one, in the context of how they were dressing then compared to today. There was a context. So if you had that context, we may mirror that today in a lot of ways. And so it was said so that you won't be molested, so that you would serve as a distinguished individual, so people would know you. The other half of that became, as we as cultures evolve, and we believe this will make you more righteous in the sight of God if you covered your face, if you covered your whole body. We started to add our own to it, and I'm saying that from a male perspective of who charters the rules and then perpetuates it in some of the cultures. So to know that, one, in the Quran it says to guard your modesty, to do so in a way, and it doesn't actually say head, but it says other part of the body down here, for those who can see.
Awesome.
Thank you. I didn't want to say it. So I think that to know that then sets the precedent for what you see after that, because then there's parts where it talks about how to cover in front of your family. When you get to a certain age, you don't have to dress as modesty, but to be aware of your modest appearance. So it makes that the etiquette of social norm, I think, was the intent of that, so that anything other than would stand out. Not to cover yourself to the point of, let's say, in my perception, if I was fully covered from head to toe in America, I wouldn't be modest, because then I would definitely stand out. It would seem immodest to people that I'm making such an extreme statement. So that's on a continuum again, and I think Al-Islam allows for that continuum.
Assalamu alaikum. So the question we had was, especially it's for the Imam, it's can you please elaborate a little bit on your experience that you had working with cross-cultural Muslim community, and as well as the racism amongst actually Muslim communities, African Americans and Africans?
First of all, he's the president of Masjid An-Noor. He's not the Imam. And that's a really good question for him. And I can't help but to chomp at the bit. And I'm going to jump into that because, Muslims, we were charged to avoid racism. The Prophet Muhammad's last sermon, reminded us that, a black is not better than a white is not better than a black, an Arab is not better than a non-Arab. And that was our charge as Muslims. The practical Peace has not, hasn't always been the practice of Islam, particularly in the United States. I think you speak of the conflict between African American Muslims and African Muslims. Growing up, there was no such thing. For me, growing up in the United States, if there were African Muslims and we met them, they embraced us, and it was like we're home, they're home, and we had that sense of familiarity. That didn't evolve until after, I think, there was a large influx of African Muslims, mostly Somali Muslims, into the United States, and the issues between African Americans who were not Muslim and Somalis started to emerge. There was cultural conflicts emerged. There was an expectation, well, I'm black, you're black, we should all be black. But the life and lived experiences were so very different. If you grew up in a majority culture and you have cultural traditions and habits that are different from black Americans who grew up as minorities, who grew up as basically exiles in their own society, they think that you should then come in and have some sense of brotherhood or sisterhood, and that's not always the case because the cultures are different. The cultural experience is different. The lived experience is different, and I think that's what led to a lot of conflict between African Muslims and African Americans. And I don't see, and I haven't seen that conflict between African American Muslims and African Muslims. Racism within Islam I have certainly seen, particularly growing up as an African American in the United States and interacting with international Muslims. But I understand that context because the same images of black people that are broadcast across the United States are broadcast across the world. So if Muslims come in from Arab countries or other countries, then they have those same stereotypes about what black people are going to be, regardless of the fact that we both practice the same faith. I know growing up as a large family, there were often times where we were discriminated against in a number of ways, in slight ways, but because our parents armed us with the understanding of racism, we were able to address those issues as they emerged. We were able to deal with some of those issues. Today, you'll see some Muslims calling black Muslims abd or slave because it's a slight. It's a term. It's a racist term that's used, an Arabic term to refer to black folks. So the racism exists in spite of our charge not to be racist in Islam. So it's important to pay attention to that. But I think that starts to get to the nuance of what happens within communities. And I think you don't get to that nuance unless you understand the bigger picture. And, we're so stuck on the, Muslim terrorists that on 9/11, when I was working at a university, someone said to me, hey, we need to make sure our Muslim students are okay. I said, well, I'm Muslim too. Well, you don't count. Because we can't get past this image of what we think a Muslim is. We have no idea of the range and the experience and the diversity within the Muslim community. So the question you ask is a nuanced, almost internal Muslim community question that's hard for this group to understand unless they can start to understand the breadth, the range, and the disparity between Muslim communities. So I think that stuck with me, and it was interesting to me from the sense that the perception of who Muslims are is so different from the reality of who Muslims are that folks can't even see me as Muslim, in spite of the fact that I've been Muslim my entire life. So, answered your question, and I took it from the brother. I think I got it. So we're going to go to the next question. Was there a hand here? Or another hand? There's a hand in the middle, and then we'll come back over here. Oh.
Hi. Did I turn this on?
It's on.
I was raised Jewish, and then I disaffiliated, or I'm not a practicing Jew nowadays, but I identify most strongly with Judaism when I feel that Jews are under attack, much like you put on the hijab after 9/11. So I can really empathize with that. And I do identify sometimes as a Jew, and I feel I could identify as a Jew and still note that in what Christians call the Old Testament, that what Jews call the Bible, that there were genocides committed, ordered by God, no less. And I'm wondering, like, when I see the history of Muhammad himself, I see him not just as a religious figure, but as a political figure and as a military figure as well. And my belief is that he was not only a military figure, but although Islam says you can only fight wars in self-defense, I believe he was an expansionist military figure. Now, could I hold those views, and that it was wrong? And I believe the genocides in the Old Testament were wrong, even though it says they were commanded by God, and I could still consider myself a Jew holding those beliefs. Could I still consider myself a Muslim if I held the belief that Muhammad was in part an expansionist military figure, and he was wrong in being an expansionist military figure?
Hold, let's see what they say first. Let's see what they say. He must say.
I would think I would put it to you this way: the context of Muhammad SAW as a military leader is later in his leadership. Initially, they were segregated, they were ostracized, and they were marginalized. You could not join Al-Islam according to the group. Long before they became what you would say an expansionist regime. To answer your question, however, is that I think every human being, and it's the fear of all of us, knows that every human being seeks to expand. That's just what we do. How we do it and the way we go about it is the challenge. Al-Islam initially was not brought about by the sword. It was through trade. The grower and expansion didn't happen in Muhammad Sallallahu time. It happened afterwards. He actually worked very moderately to contain, to manage the group, and to set the precedent, so much so that even when he took over Mecca, historically, the place that his wife, Khadijah, may Allah be pleased with her, passed away as a result of them being sanctioned, the place that initially waged war on them, he actually entered back in, declaring that there will be no bloodshed for any opposition, for anyone who initially was fighting against him presently in the past. And it was a seamless transition, something that you don't even witness today. So I would say, yes, Al-Islam allows you to manage the contradictions of human behavior within the scope of what God has ordained, because the Creator is greater in His majesty, or in His majesty, I would say, to use a non-gender term, to be able to see the whole, where we come in and look at context of the parts based on our biases. And so we do have the charge to manage our contradictions. And there's always hasana, which means the most excellent form that we should point to. But no one, and I would say this, no human being on the planet should be forced to live in a small box, in a small space, and oppressed to resign to live their lives that way. The human spirit, regardless of the faith you put on it, was not designed not to grow. It wasn't designed for that.
And the Quran says, let there be no compulsion in religion. So even as the Muslim communities expanded, there was never a requirement to submit or get the sword. I think that is a mischaracterization of Islam. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his job was to preach al-Islam, to go out and to expand. And Muslims are required to believe in the books that were sent before, so including the Bible in its original form, the Torah. So all of those things that you talk about in terms of the things that happen religiously, historically, are part of the understanding, the Muslim understanding as well. So I think it's just a slight mischaracterization of the Prophet, that he was an expansionist and that he went out and expanded by war, because that was not what actually happened. The Prophet went out and when they made hijrah, or the journey from Mecca to Medina, they went to Medina, Yathrib, and they actually created treaties with the Jewish folks who were there. They actually welcomed them in because they helped stabilize some community feuds. And then as the Muslim community grew and existed, then more people decided to join Al-Islam because they were able to see, the most beautiful model in the life of the Prophet and the Sahaba, the people who were close to him. So did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing that I would like to add is, because your question is particularly about Prophet Muhammad's policy, not generally later on what the Muslims have been doing, which may be completely wrong. Prophet Muhammad, if you look back into the details of all the places where Prophet Muhammad sent the army to fight, there was not one example in which there was already a contract with those people, which those people had violated. For example, when Prophet Muhammad sent its emissary to Ghassanites, inviting them towards Islam, and then they killed the ambassador, Prophet's ambassador. So then Prophet sent its army. Hercules came from Rome. They killed so many people. So then Prophet Muhammad sent its army to fight Romans over there in Tabuk. If you take the case of Mecca, they did not just went out and attack Mecca when they had made a treaty in Hudaybiyah, and when Mecca people violated the treaty completely and killed so many people who were from Medina and from the tribes linked with Prophet Muhammad, then Prophet Muhammad had to send his army over there in order to do that. Similarly, the Jewish tribe in Medina, who were punished over there because they had a treaty over there. There was a big war going on, and so they made a treaty with them that they will be helpful to them. And then right in the middle of the war, they came to attack the women in Medina over there by abrogating the treaty over there. So then Prophet Muhammad sent his army after the first war to them, and then they surrendered, and then so many things happened. So not a single example you will find if you go into the detail of the life of Prophet Muhammad in which he just to expand something, he will send his army. Always there was an abrogation of treaty.
I guess I would add to that. The fight in Muhammad's Islam time, is to close it out. He could not fight until there was a command in the Quran that told him to fight. He never waged a battle.
He didn't wage the battles that were mentioned. There's a part in the Quran in chapter 6 where it says, honor those who have honored their treaties, but for those who have continued, because there was a lot of trespasses, now you have proven that you are about your faith. Anger is not moving you. You're not moving by anger and revenge. And that, even in the history, there was a lot who were hurt, who wanted him to move off the anger and the revenge, and he had to wait until that was purified from the group before he executed.
So, and then just to clarify, your characterization of the Prophet as a military leader and a political leader, those are accurate, as well as a religious leader. The expansionist piece was the piece that I think history would disagree with.
Shakir, did you want to get one more?
Yes, one more question. We only have a few more minutes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Whenever a violence is committed by someone claiming to be Muslim, and I've been hearing the two opposing arguments that as Muslims we have to speak out and distance ourselves from it, and other argument that we do not have to speak out because it does not represent us. And so how do you guys view those two arguments?
The Quran says, speak out for the truth, even if it be against your own selves. So it really depends on how you interpret that verse. And I think, personally, people feel like, well, it's an affront to them because they know they didn't do it. So, I mean, I don't know that to just ignore it is probably not the Islamic thing to do. But I think you're supposed to speak out for the truth, even if it be against your own selves.
And I guess I would add that the reason why we're in this situation is because we as a cultural group, as a faith group, failed to speak out. We were wrapped up in our own pain and trauma and not wanting to take sides, and we failed to speak out. And the Quran charges the people of faith, the people of the book, that's all of us in the three monotheistic religions, to be charged as a witness. And a witness is supposed to be unbiased, speaking the truth, as was just mentioned by Shakir, that whether it's for you or against you, you honor the truth. You don't let the standard of that slip to your personal biases. So putting our head in the ground is not an option, because that's how you get hijacked, because when you look up, you're wondering what happened. How is it that ISIS is in the news and we're trying to explain their behavior? Now, and if you can go by a historical context, then I think you answer your own question for what's best for you to do. And then you should stand by that.
And it's also, Islamic tradition that if you take one life, it's as if you've killed all humanity. If you save one life, it's as if you've saved all humanity. And I think the problem is people miss those aspects of the faith and just pay attention to the prescription that Muslims are allowed to defend themselves when attacked. So people take any maybe affront and say, well, I was attacked so I could defend them. I don't know the mindset. I just know that is probably the largest challenge I think we have in the perception of Islam, because people love to pick and choose as opposed to seeing the whole of Islam. And I would encourage you all, if you're interested in really learning about Islam, you can ask a Muslim, but read the Quran to get an understanding of al-Islam.
And the call to restraint. It acknowledges that a human being has the right to go after, to seek vengeance. But there's a prescription for it. But it says, even in doing so, it is better if you restrain from anger. It is best not to take that path, lest you swerve from justice and compassion. That is actually what's in the language of the Arabiya as a prescription. Not that because you are attacked you have the right to defend, but it is the mindset and the state for which you choose to do so that for which you'll be judged. Because God has already acknowledged your right and your hurt. And if that's the only thing that's motivating you, then you may swerve from justice, being equitable, being merciful, being compassionate, which means to feel what other human beings are feeling, and exceed your limit. So we're asked to restrain.
Thank you all for coming out, and again, we want to thank Ann Phibbs for organizing this, and the Office for Equity and Diversity's education program. Am I saying it wrong? Critical Conversation. We're happy that you all chose to be a part of this. This is the third of 6 of 7. So we have 4 more. We would encourage you to come to the others and bring folks with you. And again, thank you for your attentiveness. Thank you for your questions. And we still have some refreshments for you to take on your way out the door. Thank you.